We'll kick off with Neil O'Brien, who's the Director of Policy Exchange. So we're doubly glad he's here because he's invited us all. And Neil, we've got an hour, so don't be too long, but what do you think?
Very good. Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you all of you for taking part in this debate. This is a bit like one of those kind of politicians' fakey things where you get a big crowd of people behind you to look like you've got lots of friends. I did a bit of research before this event, and as you do, one immediately goes straight to the Blairism entry on Wikipedia, which is where I get all my facts from, and brilliantly on there is actual official list of people who are Blairites. There's actually a sort of canonical list of people. Sadly, nobody on our platform is officially a Blairite. None of us are on that roll of honour, or according to taste, exercise in naming and shaming. It depends what you think. So I thought I would talk a little bit about what Blairism is, and I think I'm going to focus a bit on kind of public services and welfare, and a bit about what Labour should do if it gets into government again. So, I mean, what is Blairism? So, I mean, it's partly the thought that you should compromise with the electorate a bit. It's partly a strategy of not allowing your ideological opponents very much room. It's partly about unpicking the ideological package deals that political parties traditionally present to the electorate, that you could have a party that was both tough on crime but also in favour of better public services. And above all, I think it was shaped by the realities of being in government, increasingly over time. I mean, it's pretty clear from his book that Blair did sort of drift gradually towards a kind of more free market stance and a more kind of reformist stance over time. And I think that was just shaped by the fact that when you're in government, it turns out to be really difficult to get from more for less out of the public services. It turns out to be difficult to make things better. Now, why should we start reconsidering Blairism? Well, obviously, I mean, Labour now in opposition need to think again about why it lost and how it can change, but also about what Blairism did and didn't achieve in government. There's a sort of left analysis of why Labour did badly in the 2010 election, due to the war and not doing enough to enthuse the base, and then there's a sort of more right-leaning analysis, which would consist of issues like welfareism and the public's hardening attitudes to benefits, migration, which wasn't really at all an issue in the top 10 in 1997, but by the middle of Labour's time in government had become a huge issue which the public didn't think the government were addressing. Things like the broken society, which in the minds of voters when you listen to them is sort of a combination of the rights culture, social breakdown, antisocial behaviour, welfareism, all these kind of things. And also a sense that the public hadn't got enough in return for the increase in public spending. And that, of course, will be the big challenge if Labour get back into government at the next election. There'll be an incredibly tight public spending environment. And there is this question, which everybody always asks because it is a very relevant question: what's Labour about when it doesn't have lots of extra money to spend? So I thought I would explore the answer to that question, what can be done, through a series of Blairite cliches, starting with tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. So, what did the government Tony Blair ran do in government? It continued really essentially the policies of Michael Howard, spent quite heavily on law and order. It continued the run-up in the prison population, and as a result crime did fall. It continued to fall from its record peak in 1995. So some success, but can that success be sustained when there isn't lots more money to spend? You can't keep running up the prison population. And there's a hell of a lot you could do on criminal justice. You could look at the police. The police's detection rate hasn't really gone up, despite a 30% increase in spending. You could look at the early stages of the criminal justice system, which we intend to try and divert people from ending up in jail. But half of all the fines that we levy on people aren't paid. Half of the community sentences that we give people aren't even completed. The sort of community punishments that people are getting are things like working in a charity shop. I've worked in a charity shop and I don't consider that a suitable punishment. Prison itself is terrible. The average prison consumes £1 million worth of drugs every year. There's very little work going on in prison. They're not rehabilitative places. And we're not doing enough on crime prevention. That's about 1% of criminal justice spending. And we're not generalising from the interesting sorts of things that Jon's been pointing out about kind of public order, people dumping stuff in their front gardens, creating a sense of order. Second Blairite cliche would be education, education, education. Now a brilliant book of the same name by Andrew Adonis, which I would really commend to everybody here. Very good programme, the Academy's programme that Labour ran in government, very effective. The focus obviously now is not just replacing what Andrew Adonis calls the secondary modern comprehensives, the very worst ones, but all those cruising schools that aren't just doing well enough. Interesting things are starting to happen within the academies programme. You're seeing all the free schools and academies form into chains, and some of those chains are absolutely amazing. Harris academies, ARC academies, doing amazing things to turn around what were terrible schools for a long time and turn them into really exceptional schools. But not all chains are equal. Some of them are just kind of taking up space. And I think a challenge for the next Labour government should be about how do you grow those chains that are doing really good things to turn around failing schools? How do you make them get bigger faster? On Sure Start, exactly the right sort of thing to be doing, but not quite the right model. Sure Start, according to its own evaluation, isn't doing anything to improve school readiness. It's not helping to close the education gap between rich and poor children in the way that we hoped it would. So if there's another Labour government, it should be piloting some kind of successor programme that would be more heavily educational. It'll look more like the programmes that we know work from America, which are more expensive but also much more educational, less of a kind of bit of everything programme. On uni fees I imagine will probably end up staying. I don't imagine there will be a graduate tax. So how do we get more children to end up going to university from worse off backgrounds? We know that universities are spending a hell of a lot of money at the moment on things like bursaries, which do not improve access. Shouldn't we be encouraging them to divert that cash, spend it on things that we know are more effective, and also trying to get the best universities to get a lot more of their graduates going into great programmes like Teach First. On health, well, I'm not clear what's going to happen on the health front really in terms of Labour's policies. There's a choice coming up for the party about whether it wants to let the current reforms bed down and not have another top-down reorganisation, or whether it wants to reopen everything again. I'm not going to get too much into that. I mean, there is a choice. You could go for a more integrated model. We know from Spain, parts of America, that if you integrate primary and secondary care, if you have hospitals and GPs working more closely together, you can make savings, but there are other ways of making savings too, and there is, from the pilots of commissioning by GPs that we've been looking at, the ones that existed even before the health bill, a lot of GPs like them, and there is some evidence that they are working too, so there's a choice about what to do there. And lastly, welfare. Remember that Tony Blair used to talk about thinking the unthinkable and how welfare would become a springboard, not just a safety net, bounce people back. And again, there was quite a lot of continuity when Labour were in government with Peter Lilly had been doing in terms of making unemployment benefit more activating, the new deals, employment zones, the new deal for communities, all these things, trying to ask more of claimants, trying to sort of gently hassle people into work. Quite successful. Also very successful reforms of income support and incapacity benefit, particularly under James Furnell. Did a lot of good things during his time there. But we didn't make as much progress as we would have liked to have made. You had the number of workless households went up during the 1990s recession a lot, while individual unemployment went up quite a lot. The distribution of unemployment became a lot more unequal at the same time. You had a lot more two-earner households, a lot less one-earner households, and a lot more no-earner households, a lot of completely workless households. And in fact, we had, all the way through the years of the boom, about a fifth of households completely workless, and the number of households that had never worked doubled. So the really hard core of the problem actually got worse during the time. How could Labour do better if they get back into government again? Obviously, there's not going to be a huge amount of extra money to spend, but one could think about diverting some of the money that's currently spent on benefits that don't encourage work, like CTC, child benefit, diverting that towards rewarding those who do work hard on low incomes, like working tax credit, which I always thought was one of Labour's best inventions. You could do a lot more to make welfare a lot more personalised. Job centres are not particularly good. We have people going round and round in the system. We're going to publish some figures later this week that show how very few people who leave welfare, which is the current measure of success for job centres, how very few of them end up being sustaining in jobs. They're still there 8 months later. Instead, we've got a huge number of people in this country bumping along, finding part-time work, finding a temporary job, but then very quickly finding themselves back on welfare. So there's a lot more that can be done to improve the benefits of working, to reward people who work hard on low incomes, and also to be more demanding still and more personalised still, and to introduce, instead of big heavy sanctions, smarter sanctions on the claimants who aren't doing all they could, perhaps looking at things like welfare cards. So instead of saying we're going to cut you off of benefits completely, not talk to you again, lose all touch with you, instead having that smaller sanction that actually can be deployed. So anyway, that's enough from me. My abiding thought on Blairism is it's just a thing that's there. It's kind of like reality. It's what you end up doing if you're in government, because it is fundamentally hard when you don't have lots of money to make things better. And the public, it is true, to use one last Blairite cliche, care about what works. That's the ultimate thing. That's what the essence of Blairism is for me. And that's, if Labour get into government again, what you're going to have to keep doing.
Yeah, fight over it. Thank you so much, Neil. That's really good and meaty stuff, and you know, it's a good example of why, you know, Neil and Policy Exchange are really an organisation that you know, ask difficult questions, have interesting debates, and it's great that and that's what Neil is in business for, and it's a terrific start. Thank you very much. We're going to move to Jon now, who reconsidering Blairism is his job, and he's you know, he's the only person in the on the platform who's actually really got to decide about his answer to reconsidering Blairism. The rest of us just leech off him. But, Jon.
I would agree and echo the support for what Neil and Policy Exchange do. I think it's very generous of them to ask us to comment on Tony Blair's legacy and what is Blairism, because it is actually something, even though the tendency in the Labour Party is to paraphrase one of Tony Blair's old, one of the funniest quotes, is to leave the past to those who live in it. You know, and so we swerve around this issue about what Blairism is, which is very dangerous for Labour. So witness Exhibit A would be last year's Labour Party conference, where a person who won 3 general elections on the bounce is then heckled at the Labour Party conference. And it's incumbent on us to try and understand why that is the case, and how we can sort of have quite a nuanced understanding of what this was, what it became, and how we as a party can own it again. I worked with Tony Blair till 2000. I worked with him pretty closely on a number of things for quite a long time, and we had sort of a bit of a falling out. So I won't say more than that, but it was a bit of an uncomfortable relationship from time to time. And so I don't think I don't see it as an either/or, good, bad, you know, benign, malign thing. I think it's a much more complicated thing with all sorts of different cross currents operating. So my tendency is to see sort of Tony Blair as a sort of Miles Davis figure in the Labour Party, whereby, you know, some of the early, he had the best tunes, you know, but some of the later fusion stuff doesn't really work. And how you can sort of get a more subtle route map through your own recent history and your own re-ownership of such a powerful political force is absolutely key to me in terms of our future strategy and success as a political party. Because I think there is a real danger, and there is a real danger that political leaders are defined by those who are left standing at the death, you know? So Margaret Thatcher is owned by almost the extreme right wing in the the Conservative Party, who see her as the real deal, when in actual fact a true arc and understanding of Thatcherism was a much more nuanced coalitionary political project, which reconciled the economic liberalism of Hayek, who said he wasn't a liberal, with, you know, one nation, patriotic, conservative traditions, welded in the working class, and had a very sophisticated national political popular strategy. Similarly, I think that is the case for Blair, but he is then defined by those who are left standing at the end as a sort of extreme economic liberal, rather than a much more textured political force. And I think it's a very good day to consider some of the earlier Blair, if you want, today. Because when I was listening to Ed Miliband's speech today, the speech that it reminded me of immediately was a 1995 speech by Tony Blair at the Labour Party conference, where he talked about a new patriotism in terms of rebuilding Britain. And it was to contest that national story about who owns it, in effect, the left or the right. And listening to it today, I thought of 3 actual Labour elements. One was the Blair speech of '95. The second was Paul Keating, a Labour leader in Australia, who talked about the left nation building of the early 90s. And the third was a guy called George Lansbury, who in 1935 wrote a book called My England. And it seems to me we have to have Labour leaders who can talk with that traction around the notion of nationhood and the future, and own or contest the national story. Because, arguably, there have only been 3, well, this is empirically true actually, there's only been 3 periods of majoritarian Labour government: 45, 64, 97, when we contested successfully the national story. So in 1945, partly derived by Attlee being the second to last off the battlefields of Gallipoli and going into wartime coalition with Greenwood to support Churchill against those elements of the Conservative Party who wanted to sue for peace with the fascists, lest we forget. In 45, we contested that national story about a New Jerusalem, compared and contrasted to the 30s mass unemployment and appeasement of the Conservative Party. Second, Harold Wilson, 1964, talked about technological and scientific revolution that confronts the country, compared to the grouse moor of Alec Douglas Hume, etc., 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 and the Tory party standing up for the past. And third, Blair in 1997, where he talked about a modern patriotism, modernisation, economic and social institutions, and the culture of the country, compare and contrast to major sleaze, decay, managed decline. And you can actually see it with what Ed Miliband's tried to do today, where he's talking about rebuilding Britain, compare and contrast with the managed decline, rebuilding Britain literally being the whole frame of this conference, the policy review, which is a contest around who owns the national story. Is Labour a sectional representative, or is it a genuine, true, patriotic party? And within our own history, we've often recoiled from the very notion of left patriotism. Why? Because seeing patriotism as essentially pathological, as an irrational thing that can pull the mob, which we fear, that is always at the gate. And secondly, because of the racial absolutism involved in it, it is too white. And that's partly, so we recoil from it as well. So we can tend to send into a language of Gini coefficients of rationality, and we lose the grip, the emotion, the visceral connection around who owns our national story. Now, it is very interesting to me what Miliband is doing, which is a very Blairite thing today, I would say, at its best, which is trying to own that or contest the national story, and at the same time say that, actually, conservatism is under threat today, because the economic liberals, the cold calculators of the textbook models of perfect information and rational calculation and transaction, are winning out in the Conservative Party against the Conservatives who value nation, identity, culture, tradition. They are all to be thrown out in front of the cold economic calculus of modern conservatism. If you doubt this, get a book called Britannia Unchained. 5 young Tory MPs, and it is cold, destructive, dangerous for the character of the country. I would say that there's a massive opportunity for Labour to be the patriotic party. Ed talked about conserving things today. It's almost contest to say, could Labour have a conservative element in the face of the destructive capability of economic liberals and the gang that's in control? Compassionate conservatism is dead. Cameroonism, detoxification is dead. The hardline economic reductionists are in charge of modern conservatism, which threatens the essential character of conservatism in this country, as the notion of social liberalism is under threat as the economic liberals control the Liberal Party as well. So Labour can be the authoritative nation builders in the country. Miliband belongs to a long arc of radical patriotic Labour leaders, including Blair at its best. So it is appropriate that we're discussing who Blair is, what is his, because I think Miliband today has really landed on the best elements of Tony Blair and sort of re-owned that really radical, textured early Blair, which I found so. The best Miles Davis tunes, probably late 50s, early 60s. Thank you very much.
That's really excellent, John. Thank you so much. And you know, to bracket Miliband with the most successful electoral leader the Labour Party's ever had, with the least successful leader they've ever had, George Lansbury. That's pretty impressive. Mehdi Hasan of the New Statesman is probably going to be less generous, but more contentious, and that's very good because we want to have a good discussion. So Mehdi, it's
thank you very much.
your show.
I should point out, I'm not at the New Statesman anymore. But I should
no, well I...
Huffington Post. Beyond left and right is the motto at Huffington Post. Blair. Reconsidering Blairism is the title of this lecture, and I just thought to myself, I don't think we've ever really considered Blairism in order to reconsider it, with the greatest respect to the raft of books, excellent books, which emerged on Blair's time, one of which is by Adam Boulton. But I don't think we've ever really considered Blairism itself. I'm not sure the master himself, to use a phrase that David Cameron uses about Tony Blair, ever really quite decided, and that's why he had to publish that memoir, which doesn't quite get to the bottom of it. Certainly doesn't take a view that John takes of Blairism. Isn't it funny when you have these ideologies or
Denial.
philosophies that are named after people, and yet the person themselves is arguing with others about what it means? If there was a Hasanism, I'd like to be able to define it myself. God forbid, God forbid. Don't worry, Boultonism still to come.
Be careful what you wish for.
Careful what you wish for. Milibandism. There's two of them to fight over that. But I think the point about Blair. I mean, I was talking. James McIntyre and I recently updated our own book about Ed Miliband, and we were talking to one of Blair's closest cabinet allies, and I said to him, we were talking in the context of whether Blair would have challenged Murdoch in the same way that Ed did. And his response was, dearly as I love Tony, Tony has always been 51% Social Democrat, 49% neocon. And I thought, that's an interesting way of approaching Blairism. You can argue and haggle about the percentages. I might reverse them, up them a little bit on one side rather than the other. But I think Blair himself was always torn between those two instincts within himself, and perhaps it varied over time, as John has identified. Although, John, if I was mischievous, I might point out that Blair and New Labour only ever seemed to be good during the period you worked for him. So perhaps you should have stayed on and we wouldn't have invaded Iraq. But I'm not mischievous, so I won't say that. Just coming back to, so Blair, where does he stand? A lot of the so-called quote-unquote Blairites, whether they're on Wikipedia or not, who are critical of Ed Miliband, the argument is he can't move to the left, because Blair is about compromising with the electorate, it's about borrowing best bits from the centre-right, it's meeting where the electorate are, this is a small c conservative country. The problem I have with deploying Blair now in arguments today is that by Blair's own criteria, he is irrelevant. As Ed Miliband said during his leadership election, by the New Labour standards, I'm the modernising candidate because I'm the one who wants to move on. And the problem surrounding Blairism, wherever you identify it on the timeline, on the arc, is that it was all about accepting certain constraints, whether they were constraints based on geography, based on time, based on income. It was all about what you couldn't do and where you had to meet the electorate. And where Ed Miliband starts from is a totally different position. And in fact, where we all start from is a totally different position. Come the 2015 election, I mean, we will be, what, I can't do the maths, 21 years off from where Tony Blair was elected in 1994? I mean, that is a long time to be going back to a leader and saying, well, what principles is he using in a different world of 1994? And if you look and imagine, you want to deploy Blair now, you want to reconsider Blair now, let's forget Iraq, and put that to another, let's talk about domestic politics. Blair himself, in my view, had he been Labour leader over the past 18 months, would have got 4 of the biggest judgment calls that Ed Miliband got right, wrong. He would have called Murdoch wrong. He would have called responsible capitalism and bankers' bonuses wrong. He would have called the 50p tax rate wrong. I've forgotten the 4th one. But in my view, these are the issues he would have called wrong. We know that because he said as much, and so have his supporters. So I think you've got to look at where the electorate is now. That's what we keep being told. Where the electorate... you would have called austerity wrong. Sorry, the biggest issue of all, as we saw from the first version of his memoirs. Although I'm told now by Ed Balls' lot that he's totally on board with the 5-point plan for growth. Tony in private. But you look at that record and you say, yes, we can argue and haggle over the positives and negatives of the Blair ledger. And there were positives, of course. Everyone has their own favourite list, whether it was minimum wage, devolution, civil partnerships, sure start centres. The list is a long one. And incidentally, I've got to make the point on a side note, there is a counter-argument for another day about that first term, which says that a lot of the good stuff he did on the social front was John Smith's legacy, minimum wage, devolution, social chapter. A lot of the stuff on the economic front, spending on health, Bank of England independence, was Brown and to a lesser extent Bulls. That's a counter-argument we can have on another day. But anyway, if you do ascribe it to the Prime Minister of the day who won the elections, and of course Jon Cruddas played a huge role as well. If you ascribe it to the Prime Minister of the day who did win 3 elections, then yes, he has a positive ledger, no doubt about it. There's lots of good things, and in many ways, as David Cameron himself admitted on the doorstep of Downing Street in May 2010, Labour left the country in a much better place in many ways. But then you cannot ignore that negative ledger. You cannot come back here today in 2012, and John doesn't, and I respect him for that, and just ignore what happened from whatever your starting point is, whether it's 1994, 1997, 2001, 2003. And say, look at what was achieved, look at what happened to a Labour government. Many of us on the left, for too many times, had to ask ourselves, is this what a Labour government is for? Whether it was the demonisation of asylum seekers and the detention of child refugees, whether it was tuition fees, whether it was the foreign wars, whether it was house arrest and the suspension of habeas corpus, whether it was the demonisation of welfare recipients, whether it was the Faustian pact with the City of London, which gave us the worst financial crisis in human history just a few months after Tony departed the scene. That's a way to escape a crime. Just 6 months after he left office, you had the start of the credit crunch. So you cannot just come at this and cherry pick what you do and do not want to do. I mean, Neil mentioned there's a left analysis, there's a right analysis of why Labour lost the last election. Blair himself has come forward and said it was because they stopped being New Labour. The problem with that analysis, of course, is that while it was New Labour under Tony Blair, the party shed 4 million votes between 1997 and 2005, and Brown shed another million on top of that. So I think what was so important today, to bring it back to the Ed Miliband speech and sum up, what was so brilliant about today in Ed Miliband's speech, aside from the fact that it was a phenomenal speech without notes for 65 minutes from a man who was a very, very poor speaker over the past 2 years. I mean, this is the Ed Miliband some of us have been waiting for a long, long time. Aside from the delivery, in terms of substance, there were 2 bits that stood out for me, but didn't surprise me. You may have seen the video beforehand. All these Americans saying he was a great teacher at Harvard. In his course, What's Left, in his very first course at Harvard University, Ed Miliband played a video of the Newsnight interview between Jeremy Paxman and Tony Blair in 2001, in which Paxman asked Blair 6 times whether he wanted to reduce the gap between rich and poor, and Blair dodged the question 6 times and famously gave the answer, it's not a burning ambition for me in politics to reduce the amount of money David Beckham earns. Which was his response at the time. And Ed played that video and used that as a jumping off point to talk about inequality. And today we saw 2 lines which for me jumped out in terms of what he stands for, put aside the lack of policy proposals. One was this line that where New Labour went wrong, and which is so important right now, where Blair is so out of date right now, is the ascribing of responsibility only to the people at the bottom of the pile, only to the people on welfare, only to the migrants, only to the people seeking work, and allowing that top 1%, the top 10% to be untouched. A fundamental flaw in whatever you want to call it, Blairism. And the other point, of course, and Ed Miliband repudiated that today, and the other point, of course, is the sentence, coming back to the David Beckham interview, that inequality matters. We live in a society today, globally and nationally, where people are slowly but surely recognising that that gap, both at an international geopolitical level and at a national, regional, local level, is at the core of so many of the problems that Neil identified. And I think that is what makes Ed Miliband the modernising candidate, to use his phrase, or the modernising party leader of today, because he recognises that point, and why actually Blair doesn't help him on that front as a guide in order to winning the next election. Thank you very much.
Great stuff, Mehdi. That's really, really good. Now, Adam Boulton is, I think, the one person on this panel who's written a book about Blair. So, Adam.
Yeah.
Many of us have thought about writing books about Blair. Adam's actually done it. But he is known to you all, and here he is.
And it's called Tony's 10 Years, and it's available at all good bookshops except for the one in the... and its subtitle was Memories of the Blair Administration. I should add, I'm not here to particularly... certainly not to offer any advice to the Labour Party. I just want to make some observations on where I think Blairism is now, what the inheritance, if you like, is of Blairism. And secondly, I think inevitably one has to put that up against, as a journalist, one has to put that up against some of the things which we've heard of today, which Mehdi and Jon have already talked about. And the first question, I think, that the Labour Party should be asking itself is, how important is electoral success? I mean, it's a kind of Faustian question, but I often think my role as a political commentator is a bit like being a sports commentator, and in that sense, Sir Alex Ferguson is not as vilified as Tony Blair is, although both delivered to their teams a great deal of success, and I think it's a pity that not only was the name of Tony Blair heckled at the conference last year, but the name Miliband couldn't bring himself to use the words today, even when he was talking about the Olympics and those people who were responsible for bringing it to this country. And so, one of the things that you learn, or I've learned over 3 decades covering politics, is that there is a sort of sense of leadership style. You know, it's like generals always fighting the last war. There is a sense in which prime ministers tend to model themselves on their predecessor, even although when there's a change of government, obviously that predecessor was on the other side. And one can certainly see, and I've written about this, a lot of continuities between Margaret Thatcher and indeed Thatcherism and Blair and Blairism, and one can see a continuation now into, certainly in organisational terms, in the way that they view Blair not just as the master, but his book, A Journey, as the Bible in Downing Street today. And that, I think, transcends the sort of issues which are normally discussed at Politics Exchange and elsewhere, questions of ideology. So, you know, what is the inheritance we have from Blair, and where does the political debate stand vis-a-vis that? I mean, the first thing which we've skated around, which is quite surprising given Mehdi, is the whole question of liberal interventionism. I mean, clearly the process, the thought processes which led to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq started with the Falklands War. The perception that it was possible to use limited force for positive ends, and may remember, interestingly, Michael Foot also endorsed that at the time of the Falklands, and I think that that led to the succession, you know, the quarter century of military interventions, which we've had since, for good or ill. And I also feel, interestingly, that listening to Ed Miliband's speech today and listening to what he was saying about foreign policy, it was pretty close, it seemed to me, to that activist Blairite interventionism. He almost seemed to be talking about the notion of Britain as a bridge between Europe and America. And that is an interesting inheritance for your party, because it's something which the Conservative Party have now completely dropped. I mean, the Conservative Party does not have a foreign policy to any great sense. And I think, you know, Britain's role in the world, Britain in the world, as that famous debate at Labour Party conference year after year is always called, is something, and in the sense of patriotism, as Jon talked about, something which Tony Blair brought back to the party and which is still there. I think something else which Blair brought to politics is the question of political organisation, how to run a government. Now, clearly there was an inspiration there to a certain extent from Margaret Thatcher saying, you know, I'm not going to waste time having arguments around the cabinet table. That was something which Tony Blair adopted with quite a great deal of vigour, and he turned that into what has become known as sofa government. In other words, at the centre of government you have policy advisors loyal to the Prime Minister, unelected largely, rather than going through, you know, those things that we read about in Tony Blair's diaries of 3-day cabinet meetings to discuss the economic crisis, which happened under Callaghan and to a lesser extent under Wilson. Now, that model of government, again, for good or ill, it seems to me, is still preserved to this day. That the notion of the leader's office and the leader having his own associates around him, and that being where the direction of the party is formed, is still, I think, absolutely central to the way things are run. But, and again, I think this is probably the good news for you guys, is, you know, the Cameron team have managed to copy the form, but they have not in any sense managed to copy the calibre of people which were recruited. And that, I think, is partly because Blair had a great skill, which I think is quite a cruel skill for leaders, which is being able to use people, to see how someone who's very different from you has something to offer, something which you can use. Now, Cameron doesn't like advice, for starters, doesn't like relying on other people, doesn't like the sense that there are other people around him who know more about the subject than anything else. You can certainly see that illustrated in the reshuffle which he did. And I think, you know, one of the questions for the Labour Party between now and 2015, if it is indeed 2015, is what use you make of people. Will you find, you know, the Andrew Adonises and the Alistair Campbells and the people of the future, the people of the next generation? Because, as I say, I don't think that is something which your opponents have managed to do. And that brings me on to a question, really, rather than a statement, which is that, you know, what one all remembers from the Blair era is the whole question of the big tent, of being able to draw in apparently unsympathetic or even antipathetic elements into support. And I am not clear from what Ed Miliband said today whether the Labour Party going forward is going to be able to build a sufficiently big tent to ensure it has electoral security. Certainly the point which Ed Miliband made, that he felt that the big tent was too tolerant of powerful interest groups, is well taken, and certainly I think by the time you come to the end of the Blair era, you can see that there was an element of excess there. And, you know, again, one of the, I hate the word journey, but one of the journeys which all leaders of any length go through, it seems to me, is they move from a period of argument where they want to make their case and they want to recruit people to their side, to, the longer they're there, a period of conviction. Whereas Chris Patten once said to me, Margaret Thatcher, when she was still in power, he said, it's all over, she stopped listening. And I think Blair, certainly by the end, was in the same state of saying, you know, I just know it, yes, it's worse than that, I like him, or all those famous quotes, which I think is a very good argument. I say that as someone who's been doing my job for more than 20 years. Very, very good argument for fixed-term leaders. I think if I could pass a sort of international UN convention, it would be 2 terms or 10 years max anywhere in the world. And I think a lot of the wars would probably be eliminated. And I have tried on various occasions to get Cameron to sign up to this, so far without success. Because what Blair was able to do with the Big Tent, and this in social policy, it seems to me, is his you know, greatest success, was he was able to move up taxation, increase taxation quite considerably, without falling out with the middle class or the upper quartile. And that, I think, is a real challenge, because it does seem to me, although people will take sides on it, that, you know, there is clearly, when people talk about the 45p or the 50p or whatever, there is now going to be an ideological argument. And I think if you can achieve your ends without having that argument, I think that's a very good thing to do. Other thing, you know, which again I think is very much Cruddas territory, if I can put it like that, is the blend of authoritarianism when it comes to security matters and law and order, and social liberalism, which interestingly, and again this is like your point you made about Thatcher, you have to talk about high period Blair versus sort of post period Blair, is that that also involved not doing religion, not doing God, in Alistair Campbell's famous phrase, and it's strange that Tony Blair's release on leaving office is to, you know, join John's church and become a sort of religiously militant. Again, I think a sign of the sort of hardening of the intellectual arteries. And I think that, you know, some of those, you know, there are still questions very dear to many members of the Labour movement about social liberalisation, and I think there's a question for you how you deal with those. And I would argue that the Blairite inheritance is a noble one in this particular area, although I would freely concede that the answers on law and order never came up. One other legacy which you have, having talked about having fixed term time for leaders, is what do you do with leaders after they leave office? I think it's a very, you know, it's a very serious question. I think I mean, Tony Blair wanted to be Bill Clinton. He certainly hasn't managed to do that, and I think some of his behaviour and indeed some of his comments since leaving office have been fatuous, but I think that was partly because he felt, given the Blair-Brownite tensions, which I would contend were not dispelled but actually fought out in the leadership election, he felt the best thing to do was to be out of the country for 3 years. I think it's terrible thing to be deracinated like that. I think he said some stupid things about, you know, how he'd live in America if it wasn't for the children's education and all that. I don't think he meant that. And final thought, I just think it would be good for you if at your party conference in 2014, Tony Blair is there supporting an Ed Miliband platform, and I'm pretty convinced that he would want to be there.
Right, we've got some time for some questions and discussion. There's some interesting people in the room, and I hope they're all going to raise. I'm going to start with Nick Palmer, please.
Thank you very much. I want to focus on one specific aspect. After I lost my seat in Broxtowe in 2010, partly as an experiment to try and experience things, I went signed on at Job Centre and went through the process that everybody goes through there. And my first job was freelance translation. And the amount of hassle that you are put through was just amazing. It wasn't that the people were nasty, but I vividly remember doing translation for a Finnish firm where I was going to earn £20, and I had to, the work took me 25 minutes, and the form I had to fill out to report the fact that I get £20 took me 45 minutes. When I'd sent it in, the effect was to reduce the amount of benefit I was getting by 15 of those £20. Now later on, I became quite successful at translation. I currently make about 25,000 a year from now on top of my other job. So I'm filling out the tax form, and on the tax form, what you do is you fill in the net amount, and you don't say anything about who paid you or what your expenses are. You have to keep track yourself, but there's one little box. And there's this enormous gap between how relaxed we are about high earners and how we make life miserable for low earners. And I really think that that's something which IDS has touched on, but Labour Party needs to grasp. And that's part of the post-Blairite legacy, that we need to see that we are really on the side of people at the bottom of the ladder who at the moment barely vote.
Very interesting point. You, sir. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not one of your famous people.
No, but you're there, so speak.
I'm David Taylor Gibby and I live in Easington. I don't have the right accent, but that's where I live. I rang my wife, as I often do, and said I was coming to this meeting. Now, she's a miner's daughter. She's in touch with what ordinary people in Easington, one of the safest Labour seats in the country, think. And I asked her what she thought Blairism was. Don't forget he was MP for Sedgefield, which is next door. But she said, well, she thought it was just public relations and glitz. You know? And people didn't really know what they were getting. They felt good about it, that it was nice. And I remember at the last election, I said, you got a picture of Tony Blair, you know, with no slogans or anything at all, just a big picture of him, you know. And she said, the legacy of it is Cameron. And that's the same thing. You get a nice cuddly chap who doesn't really tell you what he's going to do, and he gets voted in, and then all sorts of funny things happen. So I think the answer of this is that you've got to have some sort of coherent narrative or intellectual idea of where you're going. You know, it's not all about PR and bits and being good on TV. So I don't know how useful that is. I know John likes it.
Could I answer that one? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point. But actually, I think it's a strange thing. I mean, I've said lots of nasty things about Spin and Alistair and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, all of that was to a clear end, was to a clear policy end, and I think we too glibly dismissed Labour, the new Labour government, as spin, and actually, as I tried to say, in a whole load of policy areas there was substance. It may be policy you don't like you know, or whatever. But you see, I think no, she didn't know. But the difference is, and that was the point I was trying to make about the team in Downing Street now, is actually, if you analyse the Blair government, it was full of lawyers. You know, the people at the centre were lawyers. Tony was a lawyer, you know, Charlie was a lawyer, Jack was a lawyer. There were loads of lawyers around all the time. If you analyse this government, they genuinely are PR men. I mean, you know, you look at it, Cameron's a PR man, Osborne's a PR man, Jeremy Hunt's a PR man. You know, they haven't got, and I think, you know, we're beginning to discover not so much spin, but we are discovering what a PR government is like.
Ready.
Yeah.
So many lawyers, yet they still managed to launch an illegal war. That's a topic for another day. You keep tempting me to Iraq, but I'm trying not to go down that road because it's such an interesting domestic political discussion. Marty, don't talk about Iraq. No, just the point, I agree with Adam actually from the same perspective. I do think it's very easy and glib to say, whether on the left or the right, that Blair was just a spinner. The Daily Mail has always been as a kind of fraud and a charlatan, and no, I don't think that's true at all. I think there was a clear aim, and I think Blair said it himself famously, you know, it's worse than you think, I really believe this stuff. And I think that is clear, and that comes back to my point earlier about the cabinet minister who said he was 51% social democrat, 49% neocon. There was always that battle. He clearly had very strong beliefs. He has strong beliefs. They evolved over time. He certainly became much more interested in the private sector and what the private sector could do both for him personally and for the government and for the state. And I think that picks up on where Jon talks about the different phases of Blairism. Whether it was conscious from the very beginning, whether in 1994, when he was elected as Labour leader, he was envisaging what he was going to do to public services between 2001 and 2005, I don't know.
I don't think people voted for it.
Let's have some more contributions. There was some over here. But I'll take you.
I was really struck by the fact that two of the things that Mehdi was saying, that people were thinking during Blair's government, is this what a Labour government's for all the time? And Adam Boulton was talking about how, like with top rates of tax, if you can cut it without having the ideological argument. And I wonder if...
No, I was saying putting up the overall
sorry,
tax
well, either way, yeah, if
yeah.
you can avoid the argument. And I wonder if maybe the issue is that there are people in the Labour Party who actually want to have that ideological argument, because it's not just about a higher rate of tax by 5p, but it's about why there are people earning this much and people earning this much, and it's actually dealing with the inequality. And if they think that's what a Labour government is for, that's why that becomes an issue. It's not that they want a high rate of tax, it's what they want to address the other issues as well. So they actually want to have that argument, which maybe doesn't make you electable having the argument. But
Let's take some more comments. You said, yeah.
I mean, the problem as a long-standing Labour member, the problem I've always had with the idea of Blairism is that the two fundamental ingredients, you don't know to which extent each contributed to success, and we confuse the two. So one is his move to the centre, and the other one that he was a consummate professional. And I can't help thinking that half of the Labour movement are wondering, do we need both to win elections? What's the ingredient to electoral success, as Adam was asking before, if that's the main question? Can we have a professional presenter who's very articulate and slick and gives fantastic speeches, but we can just give them a different narrative? So I suppose, for me, the fact that he was such a good presenter obscures my view that you do need to be more of a centrist politician, but it was harder to put your finger on it because he was so slick that you wondered if that was actually the cause of electoral success.
I'm interested that nobody's picked up on what Neil was saying, you know, in terms of kind of quite hard policy issues about, you know, there being a policy core of Blairism. And it's interesting that discussions on the left tend to be about the epiphenomena of Blairism, you know, the people, the style, you know, the smile, the money, all those sorts of things. Just my observation.
I'll pick up on something else actually. Well, one of the cliches of Blairism being what matters is what works. What really struck me towards the end is that there was a lot of evidence to say that, like, you know, the public sector reform stuff by introducing competition wasn't working, or that, you know, take academies for example. I mean, yes, they were free to many days, but they also got a lot of money, and like academies that like didn't get a load of money didn't do very well. So probably the money rather than so I mean, and it kind of strikes me now that a lot of neo-Blairites, as you might call them, might carry on repeating those kind of like marketisation tropes, not because there's actually the evidence that they deliver the results that you want, but that's because that's the last thing Blair said, and they're just stuck repeating that catechism without any like.
I think that's
it's an interesting and very good point. So, I mean, I don't agree with you about the evidence on academies, and that's an argument about the detail. I do think they work beyond just the money, and there's very little correlation between how much you spend and what you get. There is a good challenge in what you say, though, which is about, you know, it did get sort of boiled down to a cliche of just some sort of marketisation that will sort of, is like a magic wand you wave and it makes everything better. I mean, you've got to, I mean, we did some things on commissioning for people who were being tagged in criminal justice the other day. And by the way that the government have been outsourcing that, by the way they've been commissioning it, we've ended up with exactly the same technology we used to have in the late 1980s, and we're paying through your eyeball for stuff that's rubbish. And you can quite easily end up with the badly designed marketisation, fragmenting a service, and you can end up with costs. I mean, personally, I think there's a lot of potential in all these creator market things. There's a lot of scope to do more with less with them. But those of us who do believe in them have to be conscious of the power of markets, but also that, you know, used naively, they can go very wrong. So I think there's a good and legitimate challenge in what you're saying, even though I probably don't necessarily agree with you.
You'd probably add the PFI to that as well. But there's one other area which I meant to mention earlier, which I do want to mention, particularly since I think it's a sort of bit of a sore point with the party at the moment, which is that actually, although Clause 4 was done, and this was a symbolic reform, actually if you look at the Blairite record, there was a failure to reform either national democracy, get rid of the House of Lords, and those things, and more crucially, and this is a legacy which we all have to deal with now, complete failure really. I mean, John Smith did it, Neil Kinnock tried it, but Tony Blair backed away from reforming Labour Party democracy. And you know, and there is still the trade union issue, there is still the issue of party funding, and those things, I think, substantive things, precisely because in the end it was keep everybody on side, he ducked away from. And that, I think, is a negative inheritance which you now have from that era. Yeah.
I was thinking about Jon Cruddas says about beware the conservatism of the left and the right, and that, you know, he talks about the unions and current debates going on. Where do you see that? Where is the conservatism of the left and the right now? What do we have to beware of? What is modernisation?
I was suggesting that Labour should embrace a degree of conservatism, actually, because I think that could be part of that story of telling a national, contesting a national story, and parking the Conservatives on the side of that, to stand outside of the mainstream of that political discourse because of what's happening in real time within modern conservatism that threatens the actual character of the conservative tradition in this country. I would, just in terms of Blairism, it seems to me, I mean, I do accept absolutely fundamentally that it's vital for Labour to appropriate Blair. You know, it has to reappropriate it as a source of strength rather than weakness, something to be proud of. But that's by tiptoeing through and reclaiming what it was at its best. So to have this debate, it has to be cracked open, or else we swerve around. We disindent our vast recent history and our pre-election victories, and it's so irrational politically. He is a sort of victim of his success because he was a brilliant presenter, but it was a substantial political project. You know, the actual, I remember when people used to say, oh, Downing Street says this, Downing Street says that, when I worked there, well, there was 100 different Downing Streets. There were really significant political figures who were pro-union or anti-union, there were devolutionists, they were quite authoritarian, there were communitarians, there were liberals. Blair did harvest this different, and he created an intellectual community that really did test drive ideas. It was a really vibrant political system he created around Downing Street, and actually maybe to the detriment of cabinet government and different forms of decision making, which ate itself in the end because of, you know, that sofa style. But it was a substantial thing. And I'll just say one final point. The really interesting question for me is compare and contrast the speech Blair gave in 1996 at the Labour Party conference and the one in 2005. And the really interesting thing is the way he emptied his own language by the end. It became a dystopian worldview by 2005, rather than a much more warm humanitarian patriotism of the late 1990s. And that, to me, just to repeat what I was saying earlier, that is what, in real time, Ed Miliband is reclaiming.
Although quite a lot of people see parallels between Ed today and Blair's envoy in 2006, certainly in terms of his critique of the Cameron government, which at the time seemed a bit fanciful, but was almost exactly echoed today by...
I would also just add one other point. That part of that rebuilding a national story for Labour is also trying to reframe what Cameron is and him being toast in effect and you know, marginalised within modern conservatism.
Mehdi, you wanted to come in. And
Just
then
very briefly on the two questions that came up earlier. One on the gentleman who I think was spot on there in terms of where the party is and where the quote unquote Blairites are. If Blairism is what works, then I think by the end of that period in office, a lot of it wasn't clearly working. And since leaving, we've seen a lot more. And as I mentioned, the City of Regulation stuff. And yet, when he turns up for his kind of round of Andrew Marr interviews again and again in recent months, it looks like he hasn't learned anything because he comes back and says we've got to be careful about bankers. He doesn't say what Ed Miliband says today, that we need a country that is served by the bankers, not the other way around. He says things like, we'll be careful with
Yeah,
the
but
bankers.
I would say if Blair was leader now, in an equivalent period as Ed Miliband is, he would be making that.
Well,
speech.
fair enough, and we can only do with the Blair we have there. Very quickly on the question earlier for the previous guy who talked about the centre ground. It does slightly worry me, and the classic part of Blairism is talking about the centre ground, but it's talked about as if the centre ground is a geographical place. I read Peter Mandelson's book and he keeps saying, we must go to the centre ground, like you get on a train and go there and find it. I mean, the centre ground moves. One of the great insights of Ed Miliband and why he won is because he's making this case that it's not where it was in 1994 or 2001. There's been a big shift, especially on this part on finance, banking, capitalism, taxes.
we're almost out of time, but there's two hands at the back. Let's have their comments. Whichever you want first, and then the other.
I just wonder whether one of the problems with analysing any of these isms is that there's a fundamental difference between opposition and government. And that when we're looking at Blairism, there's Blairism of opposition and getting into power, and there's Blairism of government. And the two have to be looked at distinctly. Mehdi mentioned Milibandism. Well, there's a David Miliband quote, which was that third way triangulation is more suited to insurgency than to incumbency. And if you look at the two different aspects of getting into power on the one hand and staying in power, the two are different. So before we can analyse what Blairism is, we have to decide whether we're talking about the Blairism of insurgency or the Blairism of incumbency.
From the point of view of policy specifically, which you mentioned, and Blairism, I think, looking back, I think it's really confusing. It's a bit of a fug when you look at some very specific ones, and the way in which refugees, for example, were treated was mentioned. I was working for a Labour MP at the time. I remember speaking to a 13-year-old Turkish girl in a detention centre, the only person in her family who could speak English, and trying to reassure her that we'd do everything we could for her and her family without making any promises. I remember getting PLP briefs that to me were couched in the most disgusting language, basically saying how proud we were that we weren't helping people come to this country. And I'd have to rewrite the whole thing. So for me, for a man who sort of claimed to be a one-man Hadron Collider with something of a God particle in there, sometimes it wasn't in evidence. And that's why it's confusing.
Okay, now look, we've just about run out of time. I want to give each of the panellists a quick, and I mean quick, opportunity just to have leave you with a final thought or two. Let's start with Adam.
Well, just to pick up the point of the gentleman, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, I think it's generally true. I think one of the interesting things about Blairism is I think you can define it. And I think the same principles actually defined the insurgency within the Labour Party and government, which was about building coalitions, building recruits, drawing on new people from outside. And again, I think the contrast with David Cameron is interesting in as much as David Cameron, as has been pointed out by Ed Miliband, ran on green conservatism, Huskies and the rest of it, but only 2.5 years in appears to be in a position of jettisoning that. And so, I think you can define Blairism, and of course it ran alongside Clintonism and the Third Way and all the rest of it. I think you can define it, and therefore I think it has to be addressed. If it was simply a question of contradiction and selling out, in that sense, I don't think it'd be a problem. And it was, of course, I come back to this, massively electoral successful. And just to the other lady, I listened to speech today. Weren't we back precisely in that territory?
John, quick final thought.
I was going back to what happened in the year 2000 recently, where there was a commission on the future of multi-ethnic Britain, actually chaired by Bikku Parekh. And we swerved right around its final report, which could have been that moment 3 Olympics ago, where we could have stated what that national story was, right? And actually, arguably, it is Ennis, Farah, etc., who've done that 3 Olympics later, and I think it was a real turning point in Labour losing its ability to continually retell and change what is the texture of our British national story. And when we swerved around it, we entered into a colder, callous language of triangulation, etc., which I think was slightly different to what Miliband was trying to do today, was to go upstream and try and confront some of the economic liberalism that was part and parcel of that failure to address those questions of unifying things around the future of the country, and I think you can literally anchor that loss in the middle of 2000, and that was a fundamental turning point which is often ignored in terms of the changing dynamics about what constituted Blairism. But it's absolutely vital to have this discussion in the future of the Labour Party.
We're having it. We're having it.
No, I was just reinforcing the importance of the meeting.
Mehdi?
I think the reputation, the persona, the legacy of Blair, the destructive legacy of Blair, can cast as destructive a shadow over the Labour Party if it's not careful, as the reputation and legacy of Margaret Thatcher continues to cast over the Conservative Party. I think it is time to move on. I admire Jon's passion and zeal for kind of appropriating Blair, but I think it's very difficult just to take the best bits and pretend the bad bits aren't there. And I think, unlike Adam, I think it's a good thing that Labour now has a leader who wants to have ideological arguments about the level of taxation rather than have stealth taxation, and I personally hope he wins them.
I suppose the most impressive thing about Blair and Blairism was the attention to detail, and I suppose that's the challenge really for Jon and everyone involved in the policy review on the Labour side now. The things that have gone reasonably well for this government are the things that they've thought through the most, and the things that have gone badly were the things that they were less clear. Their policy review in opposition, I think, to be honest with you, but at this stage in the proceedings, it wasn't far enough ahead, but was actually possibly further ahead than Labour's policy review is. And you need to have that public conversation because you need to make your mistakes in opposition. The Tories in this stage were doing crazy things like having their quality of life group recommend that, everyone would be charged a fiver to go to the supermarket car park. And I was going, make your mistakes in that kind of public way in opposition and sort of rather than when you get into government. So I think the thing you take from Blairism is the need to be very concrete and clear and ruthless in your thinking and to get on and do as little bit as quick as you can.
Look, this is a really interesting evening, and thank you very much for taking part. And I hope we have another one. And it's really important to examine this recent period of the Labour Party's successful history and to take it forward from there. So thank you all to the panel, and thank you Policy Exchange for making it possible.